The title of the talk today is Life in the Lone Star State is Good and Getting Better. The last time I spoke here was right after I published my first book, Inconvenient Facts, and that book was driven by my own personal search for the truth. I knew some of what we were being told about climate change. My experience as a geologist was just wrong. I suspected other things were wrong. I did a deep dive, and what I found actually angered me. I found that a lot we were being told is just factually incorrect. We'll look at some of that today. That first book, when I talked to you last time, we explored and dispelled the notion of a climate crisis, and that's absolutely true, even more true today. But now what we're looking at with my new book and the CO2 Coalition, we've moved beyond that. Not only is there not a climate crisis, by almost every metric we look at, and we'll look at some of that today, almost every metric you look at, Earth's ecosystems are thriving and prospering, and humanity is benefiting from the combination of modest warming and more CO2. So let's get into it. So the big thing driving a lot of this discussion is a so-called consensus on the discussion. Well, is that really the case? In my book, I've captured some of my favorite quotes. One of my favorite quotes is from Michael Crichton, who said that there is no such thing as a consensus. If it's consensus, it isn't science. If it's science, it isn't consensus. My favorite, though, was the famous physicist Richard Feynman, who said, think about this, I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. And that is exactly what we have today in this so-called debate on climate science. They dare not allow those that present the facts, the science, and the data that disputes the climate crisis. They dare not. They need to silence me and my colleagues at the CO2 Coalition, because if we speak what's actually happening, the jig is up for this climate industrial complex. So we need to get this information out there. Who is the CO2 Coalition? We're some of the top experts in the world. The gentleman at the top left, Dr. Patrick Moore, spoke here a few years ago. He was a co-founder of Greenpeace, and he left. He now sits on our board of directors. That's right, a co-founder of Greenpeace is on our board. The gentleman to his left is John Clauser, 2022 Nobel laureate in physics, quantum physics. And the gentleman on the bottom left is Dr. William Happer, our chair, who actually was John Clauser's teacher, taught him quantum physics. So we got this whole chain of command. And then, of course, Roy Spencer at the University of Alabama. A lot of the temperature records he takes care of. A lot of things going on in D.C. We're based in Fairfax, Virginia. Because we're science-based, we've almost cornered the market on the scientists that are fighting this. They're coming to us because we try and stay out of the politics and just stick to the science. And that's benefited us well. We're now getting people come. I can't tell you all, but the Senate chairman on various hearings, they're coming to us, wanting us to it'll either be me or some of the scientists we have will be testifying coming up in the next couple of weeks. You'll be seeing Senator Whitehouse with his hair on fire grilling me probably. But we're looking, first thing that Lee Zeldin did at EPA was fire every single one of the members of his advisory boards. And what did we do? I've put up a list of 55 highly qualified individuals that we're going to be nominating. And it might be as early as later today, hopefully this week, the nomination process will be open to fill the Science Advisory Board, CASAC, which is the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. So we're ready to go with that. Also the endangerment finding, you probably have heard something about that. 2009, CO2, carbon dioxide was declared a pollutant, and that's now being challenged, or will be shortly. And we're going to be getting Ernie and Greg Goodnight is another member that's here. You have not heard it yet, but you'll be hearing about it. We're going to have an all-hands-on-deck with all of our scientists to put together comments to support that. And these things are very important. Over at Department of Energy, we've got Chris Wright, who I've met with before. We had some communication before he was sworn in. And we've developed some scientific materials specifically for him at Department of Energy, and hopefully it finds its way there. But that's written by Dr. Richard Lindzen of MIT and Dr. William Happer. So again, these are scientific basis pushing back against net zero. So what are we looking at? What do we agree with? And what do we do? Where's the disagreement? Number one, carbon dioxide is increasing. And the reason carbon dioxide is increasing is because of mainly our burning of natural gas and fossil fuels. The temperature, again, has risen about 1.2 degrees since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but there's serious disagreement. Is that temperature rise caused mainly by natural gas, or is it natural? And this increase in temperature, is it beneficial or harmful? Well, we're going to take just a look, just to make sure you're up to date on what's going on, just some of the basic science. This is Mauna Loa carbon dioxide, atmospheric carbon dioxide. I didn't bring my CO2 meter up here, but I saw it was at 982 parts per million earlier in this room, and ambient should be about 400. It's because we're all breathing out CO2. Every breath you breathe out is about 40,000 parts per million. And so this room has pretty high levels of CO2. We're right now at, I'm not going to throw a bunch of numbers at you, but right now we're a little over 400 parts per million. And if we look at the emissions here, going back to the mid-1700s, what we see here is that the atmospheric CO2 has increased by about 50%, from about 280 to 420. And again, that's a 50% increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it's because of you guys, and you should be thankful. And it's because, again, at the CO2 Coalition, one of our unofficial mottos is, we love CO2 and so should you. And so you're going to keep that, it's kind of catchy, but we promote the many benefits of carbon dioxide. This is an important chart, and what I want, as we go through this today, keep this in mind. We really didn't start adding much CO2 until that post-World War II economic boom in the mid-40s, 1950s. So it's that last half of the 20th century. If we're going to see CO2-driven warming, look for it in that period. So in terms of a geologic context, I'm a geologist, we look in terms of not decades, but rather thousands and millions of years. So it's important to put it in a perspective. And if we look back over several 100,000 years of data, we see we have these ice advances on a 100,000 year recurring schedule. And so what we see is during each of the ice advances that last maybe 80 or 90,000 years, the oceans cool greatly. And when you have cooling oceans, they suck up CO2 greatly out of the atmosphere. And when it warms, they expel it. Just think of a liter jar of ginger ale that you pull out of your refrigerator, and when you open it up, it just goes. But put that liter on your patio in the sun in Houston in August and open it up, and it's like a volcano that comes out. That's because as that warms, it's expelling CO2. But look at the very, very top right, you'll see a red dot. That's where we are today. So something's different today. All the other interglacial periods that, like we're in right now, only got up to about 280 or 300 parts per million. We're over 400. So something's different. And I'll argue that that difference is because we're liberating carbon dioxide. One of the big myths that we have out there, and you've probably heard it, there's this myth that's like Mount Pinatubo put out more CO2 than all of human emissions in history. Well, that's just false. In fact, after Pinatubo erupted, we saw a slight decrease in atmospheric CO2. There are a number of reasons for that, but it actually occurred. You didn't see an increase, we saw a decrease. And also, another thing that confirms that the CO2 that we're seeing is ours and committed from burning fossil fuels, we're only seeing 50% of the CO2 that's emitted by man is showing up in the atmosphere. Well, what's that mean? Where's the rest of it going? It's going into plant life for the most part. It's called the greening of the earth. And we see that more than 50% of the Earth's surface is what they call greening. Increase in vegetation. That vegetation, of course, is just sucking up CO2. Think back to middle school when you put probably a bean in a cup and you put it on the ones, you learned about photosynthesis. You know it needed water, sunlight, and CO2. And the more CO2, the better. And so what this increase in CO2 means, the vegetation is increasing, and that's driving forest crop growth, all from the near polar regions to the equator. Every ecological niche is benefiting from this increase in CO2. And some of it's also being incorporated in the oceans. But the big perspective here, let's look back 600 million years, and we see that, again, as I go through this today, if you see something that's blue, that's carbon dioxide. If it's red, it's a temperature history. And looking back, we see that the average of Earth's history, again, we're about 400 parts per million, 2,600 parts per million is the average. And so looking at this, we don't have too much CO2, we don't have enough. We're actually impoverished. See, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we're at near starvation levels, some of the lowest in Earth's history. One of the interesting things, I'm a geek when it comes to this, a climate science geology geek, so I'm gonna share something I put in my new book. It's my own theory, and I think it fits pretty well, is if you look back about 300 million years ago during what was called the Carboniferous, this is a period when, according to the USGS, 85% of our coal reserves in the continental United States were deposited during that 100 million years. Well, at the beginning of this time, the first trees showed up, and they were able to grow because there was a thing called lignin that allowed them to grow up. Think of it as rebar in concrete. This lignin allowed plants to grow to great heights, which was interesting. But the other interesting part, there was nothing that could break it down. There were no bacteria to break it down. So we had for 100 plus million years, these trees grew, died, accumulated, trees grew, died, accumulated, thousands and millions of years over millions of years. And that's why we have so much coal that's turned into the great coal deposits of the Carboniferous. And it was only at the end of that time when a new bacteria called lignos that appeared that started loving the trees that were accumulating there. It's fascinating. But the big thing here, this is probably the most scary chart you'll see today. This is 140 million years of carbon dioxide data showing just the steep and almost linear decline of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that red line at the bottom is what I call the line of death. And what that is, it's the minimum threshold for plant life to exist. We nearly got there. That's 150 parts per million. We got to 180 at the end of the most recent ice advance. And so what we're doing now is liberating the carbon that was locked up in all those coal swamps of the Carboniferous. We're liberating the CO2 that was sucked out of the atmosphere by the coal and locked up underground. And I view this, both coal and oil and gas, as really a solar energy source. Because what drove it? Photosynthesis, sunlight, and CO2. So we're really liberating this solar energy source that's been locked up. So let's take a look at temperature, both globally and in Texas. I think you'll find this fascinating. We're doing a series of state and regional reports. I was hoping to have the Texas, my goal was to have it here today to distribute to all of you. It should be done shortly. And so we've done this for the Midwest, for Pennsylvania, for Virginia, recently for Wyoming, to great acclaim up there. Texas is next up, so we should have that in the next month, and I'll make sure that Ernie gets notified of that, and we'll make that available for all of you. This is global temperature from the HAD-CRUT 5 database. This is, general agreement is that we've had about 1.2 degrees centigrade increase since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, well think about this. You've probably heard that we dare not let temperature get more than 1.5 degrees or it's all over. It's game over, climate crisis is here, we can't correct it. Well, think about that. That 1.5, it's already risen 1.2. So what they're telling you, whoa, we can't let it get 0.3 of a degree centigrade warmer. That's half a degree Fahrenheit. It warms more than that between 11 a.m. and noon almost every single day. If you're worried about half a degree Fahrenheit, move 17 miles farther north, and your average temperature will be dropped by half a degree Fahrenheit, or 200 feet higher in elevation. Think about it. Common sense tells us this is just crazy to be worried about half a degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature. And also, we'll go back. If you look here, there were really two great warming periods in the 20th century. One was in the period 1910 to 1945 during very low carbon dioxide levels. The other was 1910 to 1945, or excuse me, 1976 to 98. Well, which is which? It's the same X and Y axis. One was at very low CO2, one was at fairly high CO2. Well, I'm not going to make you guess, this is it, but they're indistinguishable. But yet we're being told one of these was being driven, dangerous warming being driven by carbon dioxide. Again, does that make sense to you? It doesn't to me. And this is the longest thermometer-based temperature record on Earth, the Central England temperature record. And we can take this back, and we see here that starting in the late 1600s is when the warming trend we're in. We are in a warming trend. We're in a warming trend that started more than 300 years ago, long before, 200 years before we really started adding much CO2. So this is one of the things they look at is, and this is my wife. I was on a cruise to Alaska. We're in front of the John Muir Glacier in Glacier Bay, Alaska. Some of you probably have been there. And of course, the captain announced that this is John Muir Glacier and it's proof of global warming, is what they told us. And really? So I took a look at it. This is a map of Glacier Bay that shows, it goes back, it's very well mapped where the glaciers were. And if you had been there in the late 1700s, there was no Glacier Bay because it was full of ice. And it started retreating in the late 1700s. And you can see each one of those yellow lines periodically is what the date was when it was there. So about 90% of the retreat of that glacier occurred before we started adding much CO2. But they want you to believe that that the warming and melting of the John Muir Glacier and Glacier Bay is because of carbon dioxide driven warming. Again, it doesn't meet the smell test for CO2 driven warming. And again, this is a map or a chart of 169 glaciers around the world showing the shortening. And again, the blue line on the right of the chart is where we start, where it's more CO2. And so this with glacier shortening that began in the early 1800s and about the same shortening to today. Again, that's 169 glaciers average. So what's up with temperature in Texas? You're being told that you're baking and it's getting hotter and it's a crisis. Well, this is the US HCN data set. And it goes back to 1895. Some of it goes back to 1870. So we've got these records. The average temperature here in Texas is basically what it was in the early 1900s. We're not seeing a huge increase of temperatures in Texas. But one of these things too, if you look, is that the temperatures measured here are adjusted. It's not the raw temperature. What did they do to adjust the temperatures? The older temperatures were all cooled, and the modern temperatures were adjusted upward. Now, what's that mean? That means that it exaggerates any warming that you might see. So just keep that in mind as you're looking at this. And again, this will all be in the new Texas report. We're being told too in Texas and across the world, what's the worst thing we're going to expect? It's heat waves. It's terrible. It's killing people. Is that the case? 5 years ago, and I'm going to encourage you, if you want to pull out your phone so I won't be insulted, but I want you to, if you would have searched for EPA and heat waves, those 3 words. It is 3 words, by the way. Heat waves is 2 words, not 1. But if you search or Google for EPA and heat waves, this is the chart would show up, showing a huge spike in heat waves in the 1930s. If you do it today, I looked yesterday, it was still there. Lee Zeldin's going to take it. I'm imploring them to take this down, but this is what you'll find. This is the heat wave index on the EPA. If you Google heat waves, and it says heat wave characteristics in the United States. Heat waves are increasing. Okay. I took a deep dive. If you look far down in the text, you'll find that it's data for the 50 largest metropolitan areas in the United States. what they're doing is representing, the data they show is correct, but they just don't tell you what it's from. These urban areas have man-made urban heat island effect. And how dishonest is that? How can anyone, well, they sleep pretty well. They get paid pretty well. But this is an example, just one. We'll see others as we go through here today. One example of how they distort the information. Who's going to look at that and do the deep dive? All they see is heat wave index increasing. So instead of the top left chart, they show you the bottom right chart. Instead of the science and the true science, the facts and the data, they hide it. So Lee Zeldin has some work to do. This is on the EPA website. They've got more work to do there. DOE's cleaned up their website pretty well. So what's going on in Texas? Let's look at Texas maximum temperature. And again, I've put the CO2, atmospheric CO2 here in blue. Texas maximum daily temperature. Is this what you thought you would see? Is this what the mainstream media is pushing in Dallas or Houston or Tyler? No, you wouldn't know this. Again, this comes from NOAA's United States Historic Climate Network data. And again, CO2 versus temperature, we don't see much of a change, do we? And so very hot days in Texas, what's going on? Well, yeah, but these heat waves are getting really bad. I remember 2 years ago outside of Dallas. Well, no, let's take a look. You hear all these reminiscences of people, and your memory's actually quite bad, I'll tell you, because you remember what's happened recently and don't recall what happened during your grandma's time, 80 years ago, 20 years ago. So here's very hot days in Texas. This is the percentage of days that are above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And what do we find? It's actually been in decline. The very hottest days of Texas, over 100 degrees, have been in decline. Yeah, we have some years that are bad. But again, this blows up the narrative. And again, I've got the blue atmospheric CO2 there. CO2 is increasing, but the hottest days aren't. Again, as we go through this today, just be thinking of all the things they're lying to you about and keep asking yourself, what else are they lying to me about every time you hear one of these alarmist claims? And so the big claim, why are we trying to go to net zero? Why are we encouraging a transition away from coal? We must move to natural gas and get away from coal. It's all because of the demonization of carbon dioxide. And so let's just take a look first at carbon dioxide versus temperature through time. And one of the first things we look at is just remember, we said CO2 began increasing in the mid-20th century. Just as CO2 began increasing in that post-World War II era, temperature went into a 33-year decline. And so we have, again, the blue is CO2, the red is temperature, and we had that period. I was in college studying geology in the 70s and late 70s, and we were being told that it's likely we may be going into another ice age because we'd had 33 years of cooling, and if you look back in 1978, and we had 33 years, we don't know when it's going to stop. And it really looked that way. So we had 33 years of cooling, all the while CO2 was increasing. We saw the Central England temperature record. This was the longest thermometer-based temperature record available versus CO2. Again, we saw recent CO2, but the warming started 200 plus years before we had to start adding CO2. And let's just take a look at that same chart with a smaller y-axis to put it more in perspective. CO2 rising, temperature barely rising. And a little bit longer perspective, let's take a look at the last 1,000 years of data. If we go back to what's called the medieval warm period, the last of the big warm periods and most recent of the previous warm periods, it was much warmer than it is today. And again, it was warmer, but much lower CO2. And again, we had what was called the Little Ice Age there between the two that goes back from about the year 1250 to 1850 is probably the coldest period in Earth's history. And we know, we can use, I like to use historic data And what we do is we're looking at this historic data. Everybody understands things like that. Like, for example, if we're in Virginia and you go to Mount Vernon, George Washington, Martha Washington liked to have ice in her drinks in the summer. And so George built her a well it was insulated, and he'd have his slaves or indentured servants every winter go down to the Potomac, and they'd cut the thick ice and haul it back up the hill to be put in the freezer area, the storage area there for the use by Martha in the summer. Well, think about it. This is documentation how we can use historic data like that to confirm that it was a lot colder. I mean, Potomac doesn't freeze like that. Maybe once every 30 or 40 years, but it happened every single year. And again, we can use that kind of historic data for olive groves and vineyards to use that historic data to tell where it was really warm. And so, again, we have the medieval warm period during a period of very low CO2. And if we look over the last 8,000 years of temperature data in red, carbon dioxide data in blue. Again, it's counter. We're having increasing CO2, decreasing temperature. One of the things we do too at the CO2 Coalition, we've got a series of billboards we've put up across the United States. This was on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and heads were exploding as people were driving by. Sleep well, there is no climate crisis. Well, this was most recently put up for 6 weeks around Salt Lake City. So you too could have a billboard like this in Tyler, Texas, okay? It's all ready to go. It's not that expensive, and it sure is fun. So the story I want you to remember and leave you with today is things are good and getting better. And it's not just here in Tyler, Texas, or even America. Things are getting good globally. Again, when I put this up, heads explode. What do you mean global warming saves lives? Well, if you take a look at temperature-related deaths, the largest study of its kind was done by Dr. Antonio Gasparini and a team of physicians that took a look at 74 million temperature-related deaths around the world. And what did they find? They found that 20 times as many people die from cold-related deaths as heat-related deaths. And another study soon after concluded it was 15 times as many people die from cold as from heat. So what's that tell you? Global warming would save all those millions of cold-related deaths. So we should celebrate that. Now this is something, you're pretty technical people here. I want you to look at this. I exposed this here last year. It was the most recent study on temperature-related deaths. And again, this is how they lie to you. This is how they trick you. This is how they provide disinformation to you. This chart was in the journal Nature, and in this they concluded that cold related deaths were 10 times the heat-related deaths. And this is the chart that they showed. And I looked at it and I said, wait a minute. I looked a little bit closer and look at the X scale for the cold-related deaths. It was 0 to 250. Any of you data guys know what's going on here. The heat-related deaths were 0 to 50, the red. So what that did was exaggerate by 5 times the heat-related deaths. Now, was it factually correct? Yes. But just like we saw with the EPA and the heat wave index, they misrepresented the data they were showing. Here's what it should have looked like. I took and remapped it. This is the chart on the right, is what that should look like. And the chart on the left is what they represented. This is how they provide this information to you. They don't tell the whole story. And it angers me that we'll have scientists that would do this. Who would really do this? And who would not stand up? It turns out there aren't very many brave scientists. I'll tell you a story, though, of one brave scientist, Dr. Byron Soypian who's going to be he's writing the Texas report. He worked for in the carbon capture business. And I got a call from him, and he says, I want to come work for you. He spoke at conferences, wrote papers, very technical papers on carbon capture. And he says, I read Challenging Net Zero with Science, which I've got them to take with you. He read this report. They're free. Please take one with you, along with some other materials we have there. He read that, and it opened his eyes, and it caused him to look further into it. And he came to me, and he called me again, and then again. Finally, last time he says, Greg, I really want to come to work for the CO2 Coalition because I quit my job. He quit his job. He says he couldn't stand. He realized he was working for Emperor Palpatine, and he wanted to come work for not Darth Vader. He wanted to come work for Luke Skywalker. And so, how brave of a person is that to walk away? He says, I can't live a lie. And he came, and he's now, he lives in Houston in the Woodlands, and he's our science and research associate. And again, he's doing the Texas report. You'll see his name coming up. So that's the kind of people we need more. Dr. Sapoyans and fewer of these other people. And again, global deaths from natural disasters have declined nearly 98% since 1900. Again, completely contrary. This is all UN data that we're getting from the UN CRED. It flies in the face of what you're being told. Tornadoes, the strongest tornadoes, EF3, 4, and 5s, those are the big ones. They've been declining, not increasing. But you wouldn't know because they use every storm, every disaster, every opportunity to link man-made climate change to a disaster. They do it. You know they do. For example, there was one last year. They linked increasing toenail fungus to climate change. There was a recent one, and this one was actually probably true. They linked increasing poison ivy, and there's truth in that because the benefits of CO2-driven plant growth is equally distributed among poison ivy as well as the good plants. So that was one that actually might be true. Landfalling hurricanes. We're told they're increasing in both intensity and number. Not so. The data doesn't show it. I couldn't find the Texas data. I looked at every state on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, and only Mississippi, which only has about that much exposed, had an increase of landfalling hurricanes. And what you want to do if you look at hurricanes, you want to look at landfalling hurricanes because we know every single hurricane that's made landfall in the United States going back to 1850. And we can confidently chart that out, and that's what I've done here. But other than Mississippi, all the other states had a decrease or stable number of landfalling hurricanes, Texas along with that. And here, this is Texas data for hurricanes. The black is intensity, the red is the number. And again, for Texas, we don't see an increase in either intensity or the number of hurricanes. This is another great, well, it's not a great example. It's a terrible testament to what passes for science in the United States and the world. The National Climate Assessment is just a horrific mess of misinformation, disinformation, and it's just terrible. This is one example. This was the beginning of this chart on extreme weather. They used this chart here. This is area burned in the United States. Looks pretty bad, doesn't it? But they didn't list a source or a reference. That's a cardinal sin, right? If you're gonna show this data, where's it coming from? What's your source? Well, you might guess I went back and I found out what the source was. It took a little bit of work. Here it is. This is the source. They had data. They started this chart in 1983, that one, the orange in the inset. They had data going back to 1926. Why didn't they show that? because it didn't fit the narrative. Why did they choose 1983 to start their chart? It was the lowest number, both number and area burned of the 20th century. So if you're going to start a chart, if you're going to create a chart that wants to show an increase, you better let's start that chart where it's the lowest and then go forward. Has there been a slight increase in area burn? Yeah, but that has more to do with forest management than it does anything due to the climate change. And again, we're seeing time. I could show you 30 of things like this, where it's just misrepresentation, cherry picking, and they're doing this to strip away your freedom systematically, your freedom to choose what to drive, how to heat your home, what temperature to heat your home. They want to control every aspect of your life, and they're using carbon dioxide demonization to do it. And again, if we look at global fires, this is forest fires have been a long term. This goes back to 1900s. And this came out of the Canadian Fire Service. And they said our results suggest a notable declining rate of burned area globally. And they attributed it, get this, to increasing CO2, the CO2 fertilization effect. And you probably go, what? What's that mean? That's because with increasing CO2, trees and plants don't need as much water. Soil moisture is retained, and it doesn't lead to aridity. Low CO2, they're using lots of water. So there's a great drought prevention element with increasing CO2. And they attributed that. With the launch of the Copernicus satellite in 2003, we were finally able to really accurately assess area burn globally. And so with this, again, this is confirmation, satellite data. Globally, the area burned is in decline. And again, we're seeing time after time after time. You've never heard this. You've probably never seen this. And they need to keep us silent on this information. Well, sea level is a big issue here. Just like we saw with glaciers and the retreat of glaciers, sea level started rising at the end of what was called the Little Ice Age, because we had glacial advance and sea level fall. And in the early 1800s, we started having sea level rise. And again, associated with the glacial retreat. And you'll say, well, Greg, why didn't glaciers start retreating earlier? And that's because it took a while we needed to get it warm enough that summer ice melt exceeded winter ice accumulation. And at that point, you get retreating glaciers and you get increasing sea level. And so that's what we see. Here's Texas. I took a look at, I think there are 15 stations that we could have looked at. These are two of the longer sea level gauges that we use. And the important thing to look at here is not that it's not rising. Of course it's rising. We know that. Sea level rise is at the rate of 7 inches per century. I think we're going to come back to that. 7 inches per century. It's not too alarming to me. And the key here is we don't see an acceleration of sea level rise with increasing sea level rise because of increasing CO2, increasing warming from CO2. So this is Galveston and Port Isabel. Again, I could have shown a bunch. They all showed about the same thing. And the UN, this is kind of a fun, I've been using this a lot in my interviews, is the UN identifies 25 or 28 highly at-risk islands and nations around the world. And the Maldives and the Indian Ocean are listed by the UN as the most at-risk islands in the world. And so the highest point on any of the islands is about 14 feet above sea level. So that's pretty at risk. And they are expected to be underwater by 2050. And of course, the Prime Minister of the Maldives, of course, there are pictures of him. He's got his hands outreached. He wants climate reparations because all those people will have to move and they'll be underwater. Is that the case? So 15,000 years ago, the Maldives were also just above sea level. And in the last 15,000 years, sea level has risen 400 feet. Why are those islands not under 400 feet of water, you might ask? Good question. And it's because of a geologic process known as accretion. Now, those of you that are divers, scuba divers, snorkelers, you know that corals grow really fast. But how do we get that material up on the island? It's a process known as accretion. The storms, as they come in, they wash the sands and gravels on the near shore environment up onto the island, and then winds distribute them, and critters move things around. And it's a slow process, but geology is a slow process. But it's interesting too. We've got a new book that's over here too, available. Please pick it up if you have kids or grandkids. It's my latest book, actually. Chloe the Clownfish Sleeps Well at Night. And so please take it. It's free for you, and it tells the story a little bit about what we're talking about here. And in the book, you'll also learn that 80% of the sediment and the sands that are on these islands, you'll be interested to find out, is actually parrotfish poop. And so what the parrotfish do is eat the corals, and it goes in one end and out the other. And so 80% of that sand is actually corals that have gone through the parrotfish. And so what that does is, again, this is accretion that uses this, washes the sand, the material up onto the islands, is distributed. Have anybody, no, I would guess, I'd be shocked if any of you have ever heard this, that 400 feet of sea level rise has occurred over the 15,000 years in those islands that they're talking about. Now think about this too. They're saying that the Maldives are going to be underwater by 2050. At the rate of 7 inches per year, that means it'll be 2 inches of sea level rise. So think about it. The last 400 feet of sea level rise didn't put those islands, but the next 2 inches, that's going to do it. They're going to be in real trouble. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't. But that's what and people, they hide this kind of information. And they have to, because if this gets out again, it wipes out this entire narrative. And we can see this time and time again. If you look at the islands, more than 80% of the islands that we've looked at are either stable in area, size, or slightly growing. And again, completely blows the narrative out of scale. The other thing to look at here, in Maldives, if you Google Maldives and Forbes, there's a recent article in Forbes. There were 14 new resort complexes being built on the Maldives and 4 airports. Think about that. So we've got equity companies funding these. We've got multinational insurance companies that avoid risk like the plague, insuring this probably hundreds of millions or tens of millions at least of dollars of investment. These insurance companies, do you think they're going to insure these if they're going to be underwater in 20 years? There's no way. I mean, I live in Florida, and it's tough getting insurance. We can get it, but it's pricey. But would they do that? Think about that. It just doesn't meet the smell test. And just as an aside, when I moved to Tampa, in the Tampa area, they said, don't worry about hurricanes. Tampa never gets hit by a hurricane. And then 2 hurricanes later, this past summer, we got tested. And the greatest benefit by warming in CO2 has to be crop production. And what we see, think about this, how does warming help crops? It extends the growing season. If we look at the growing season in the continental United States has increased by more than 2 weeks. What does that mean? That means that killing frosts end earlier in the spring, arrive later in the fall. If you have an apple orchard, what do you fear the most? It's a late spring killing frost, isn't it? That could ruin your entire year. Well, because of warming, we have fewer of these, and you don't have that fear as much. And you get more plantings in with a warmer, longer growing season. And then that's turbocharged by CO2 fertilization effect. And then judicious use of nitrogen fertilizer is a big effect. And so if we look here, we look at grains, coarse grains, rice, wheat, CO2 rises, temperature rises. We're breaking records year after year after year. Probably the greatest example of that is one of the hottest countries on earth is India. And we find that India, even in India, that's been plagued with famine and crop failures for thousands of years. They've been blessed by year after year of record-breaking crop growth. I have my other research associate is Vijay Jayaraj. He lives in southern India and writes a lot about this. He writes about climate colonialism, but also about how the subcontinent's benefiting from the combination of warming and more CO2. And again, this is corn production in America, which is, it's almost marching in lockstep with increasing carbon dioxide. So we have this carbon dioxide driving crop growth. What you enjoyed today was all, even the meat, it was based on the meat, the animals that we slaughtered for that was actually, it was using the crops that they were eating. So it all goes back to increasing photosynthesis driven by carbon dioxide. And this is in my latest book, I took a look at the top 8 crops in the world in terms of production. Almost every crop, well, every crop I looked at was increasing. These top 8 are breaking records year after year after year after year. But the predictions are, if you look at the IPCC or any of the reports generated by the government, they predict crop failure and famine. And here in Texas, I just took a look at 2 of these. I was doing this late last night, but I believe this is rice and wheat. We could have picked out some of the other crop, but this is Texas wheat and rice production. Again, not being harmed at all by what they're claiming to be record-breaking warmth in Texas. One of the things that I really love to talk about is the strong correlation between human history and temperature history. And there's this tremendous correlation of the warmer periods. If you go back through human history, back to the first great civilizations, there were 3 other warming trends similar to what we're in right now, but all of them were warmer. If you look at these, each of the great warming periods coincided with huge advances in civilizations and empires. Life was good, food was bountiful. The first of these was called the Minoan warm period, or the Bronze Age. And the first great civilizations rose up: the Hittites, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Harappan Empire in the Indus River Valley. All of these great civilizations grew up in this really warm period. How do we know it was warm? Well, various things we can use, but I like to use historical data. We know that they were growing a crop called millet in Scandinavia. Well, it's a crop that can only be grown today in tropical or semi-tropical climates. And they're growing it during this period in Scandinavia. And we can use records like that to tell it was much warmer at that time. And then it started getting cold. And it got cold pretty quickly. And within maybe 50 or 100 years, all of these great empires collapsed. And it's most likely due to the cold. What we see is when we started getting cold, we had crop failure, famine, pestilence, and mass depopulation. It was repeated time after time after time. The warm periods were great. The cold periods were horrific. And so it was called the late Bronze Age collapse. Again, if you don't believe me, pull out your phone and just search for that late Bronze Age collapse and find it. And then it started warming. The time of Christ, the Roman warm period was good. Actually, ancient Egypt was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire at that time. And then it got cold again when we went into the Dark Ages. And again, the medieval warm period was a time of blessing. I wish I had added the section. There was a section I normally have here on the witch hunts of the late Middle Ages, because it started getting cold, and the crops started failing a lot. A famine set in. People started dying, starvation, and they blamed it on weather-causing witches. And so they started killing lots of witches. And I have a chart in my book that correlates the number of witches killed per decade with the temperatures. And there's a strong, I wish I'd put that, but it's kind of, everybody laughs when you see it. It's funny unless you're accused of being a witch at the time. But it was funny, around 1540 it warmed up for about 40 years, and food came back, crops came back. And why was food bountiful, food plentiful? Because they said, praise the Lord, we've killed all the witches, and now he's, right? And they thought that, and then for 40 years, they had bountiful harvests, and then it started getting cold again, and then it went back to the witch killing. But again, this is a relationship that we see right now. If you look at it, who are the witches in our society today? It's everyone in this room. You're the new witches that they're going after. But let's stop that. And again, we already talked about the little ice age in George Washington. One of the things I'm most proud of at the CO2 Coalition is our education initiative. We had 3 years ago, our members came to me and were very concerned about the state of science education in America. They said, our children and grandchildren are being indoctrinated into a climate cult. They're being taught groupthink and consensus science. They're not being taught the scientific method. They're not being taught critical thinking skills. And we want to do something about it. And we looked at it, and you may not be aware, only 2 states in the United States in their curricula teach the scientific method. It was removed a couple of decades ago. Greg Goodnight here is doing something. He's working hard. One of our members, he and Marty Cornell, working in the state of Texas. They're working hard on your behalf and your children and grandchildren's behalf to fix this in Texas. And they're getting some real success. So thank you, Greg, for what you're doing there. It's not a done deal yet. We're doing this. We got it, the CO2 Coalition, working through some of our members, got it added back to the North Carolina. And so it's a small thing, but as a scientist, we think it's really important. And so what we have here is we have a series of now 6 books. One of the favorites we had before was called Simon the Solar-Powered Cat. And it was a story, and we're able to use science in an entertaining way, and importantly, we have lesson plans that go along. We're being embraced by the homeschool community. And so our lesson plans are put together by our senior education advisor, Dr. Sharon Camp, who's a PhD in chemistry, was an AP science teacher. These are lesson plans about science created by scientists. And so they go along with the book. And again, we have Chloe the Clownfish that are available for you to take back here. I did this working in collaboration with the top reef expert in the world, Dr. Peter Ridd, to get the science right. And you may not know, but Dr. Peter Ridd was fired from James Cook University about 6 or 8 years ago for telling the truth about what's happening on the Great Barrier Reef. He was fired. He recently won a lawsuit, thankfully, against James Cook University in a big settlement. But that's what they do for people that speak up. He said, no. The science tells us the Great Barrier Reef the health of the Great Barrier Reef is just fine. It's great. A great example of how we need to be silenced. We went to the National Science Teaching Association annual convention, had a double booth, and we looked at their climate change policy, and it was horrific. It was not teaching science, it was teaching groupthink, consensus, and just really bad disinformation. So we published a publication. It was called Challenging the NSTA's Position on Climate Change. We went there. We were overwhelmingly welcomed by the people at the convention, and then the top dog showed up, and he said, you have to take that material down. We can't have that up there. I said, why not? He says, because it's our convention, you can't criticize us. I said, well, I told him to go pound salt. No, I'm not going to take it down. He said, then you have to get out. They kicked us out of the convention. I've talked to people that have been in conventions for decades in their whole lives. They've never heard of anything like that. And so this is us. We packed ourselves up. Now, bear in mind, that's me. They call themselves Charlie's Angels, I guess. They have a lot of fun, but they're all PhDs. They're probably the only PhD scientists in the entire convention, and we got kicked out. So we wore that as a badge of honor, and they have to that's just one example. They have to silence us. And hopefully there's a new sheriff in town and a bunch of new deputies, because we at the CO2 Coalition aren't going to back down. We're going to continue being at the forefront of this. And so I want to thank you all for giving me the time here today. And just, again, keep in mind what you saw here today. You saw evidence that you're being lied to on a daily basis. You saw evidence of disinformation being spewed by our government sources. And so much of it is very similar to the COVID, isn't it? In that they needed to shut down those that were trying to speak up and silence those. And it's that on steroids in the climate change debate. So thank you very much. I really do appreciate it.